going to sit down, come in to rapturous applause, rather than be seated.
Yeah, but the applause will be for you.
No, because I'll be introducing you. Do you want me to go? Okay. Aha. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Quarter House. I'm Alistair Upton, Chief Executive of Creative Folkestone, and I'm welcoming you here to the last plot in the clearing. Now, I don't think very many of them actually took place in the clearing because the audiences were of a size that we needed to come here to the auditorium, which is very pleasing. These are in the format of a salon, and salons coming from 19th century tradition where a woman would invite people round to her house to discuss the matters of the day, or culture, art, science, etc., because they were excluded from academia. So it became an alternative venue for that inclusive conversation. So I start by apologizing slightly that I've muscled my way in and made it an entirely male agenda with myself and Lewis. But I will be passing back to the organizer of these, Liv Pennington, after I've finished. It'll go to Lewis, who's going to talk, and then he will take questions. And he's looking for a lot of participation from the crowd and questions coming in. The reason I muscled my way in was because this is a momentous event in a way, because Lewis is talking not just about this triennial, but 3 triennials. And this is the last formal speaking event as the curator of the Folkestone Triennial. Lewis and I started here on exactly the same day, so that's why it's kind of important to me. January the 2nd, 2012. I mean, we had worked in Liverpool. Lewis has a long and distinguished career. He founded the Liverpool Biennial and ran that for 10 years. And before that, he was director of Tate Liverpool for a decade, moving up from the Arnold Feeney in Bristol. And you know, that long distinguished career then was the benefit of Folkestone. He came here, but he's continued to work internationally, whether it be in China or in other European destinations. But I think this had a very soft spot for Folkestone over all of that time, and we have, as a community, benefited greatly from Lewis's experience, wisdom, and real empathy for the town. He took the staff team on a tour of this triennial before it started, and I think almost the first thing he said was, when he came to the first artwork, is like, all artworks must be able to stand on their own and be an artwork on their own, but they gain an additional meaning when placed within the context of the other artworks and the theme of the show, the plot or the subplots and the walks around. And so what's particularly interesting tonight is that Lewis is going to talk and do exactly the same thing, that for him as a curator, the triennial here in 2021 sits within a body of work, and it stands alone, but it's also very interesting in terms of the triennials in 2017 and 2014. So please welcome Lewis Biggs to the stage.
Thank you, Alistair. Very beautifully turned. I'm going to take my mask off because you can probably see me even if I can't see you. Yesterday morning I woke up with a terrible sore throat, which will be evident from time to time. But I hope you're far enough away from me not to catch anything that I might have. So I'm going to talk about, I'm going to talk for about 20 minutes probably, or maybe 25, and then invite questions from you, because actually I rather prefer dialogue to me just talking. So if you have some questions already, that's brilliant. But if you can think of more questions or just things you'd like to mention while I'm talking, that would be excellent. And before I start, I'd just like to thank Alistair for appointing me to do these 3 triennials. Of course, I didn't know when he appointed me to the first one that he was then subsequently going to appoint me to the second and the third, but, because each one is a closed contract. but it's been the most important work in my life, definitely for the last 10 years. Although, as he says, I've done several other things at the same time, like Land Art Mongolia, for instance, which is a biennial in Mongolia. Not nearly as interesting as Folkestone. Nagoya, I mean, yes, a big and interesting city, but not nearly as interesting as Folkestone. And so that's thanks to Alistair and thanks to Liv and Joanna for organising these salons and all the rest of the public programme, and Sophie, who's been such an able assistant. I have to thank the hosts. I know there's some former hosts or current hosts in the audience tonight, and as I tell them, the hosts are the people who actually make the exhibition more than anybody else. I mean, it's the viewer that makes the exhibition. The artist puts something in public space, and then it's turned into art by all of us who look at the art and talk about it. It doesn't start as art. It becomes art in the process of us appreciating it. And the hosts, of course, are key to that process, because it's their conversation, their dialogue with visitors that is the front line. And of course, I do want to thank the artists, because without the artists there'd be no art and no exhibition, and the project managers, and in particular Joe Cowdery. I don't know if Joe is with us tonight, but I couldn't, well, these exhibitions wouldn't be what they have been without Joe, who knows Folkestone so well and knows artists so well and works so hard to bring everything together. So that's my thank yous. I'm going to talk about four things, really. There's the context for the Triennial in Folkestone is from the beginning, from 2008, shall we say. I think it's really interesting at this moment, 15 years on, to look back at that moment and why a triennial, what it could mean. Then I'm going to talk about my own interpretation of the brief of the triennial when I was appointed in January 2012, and the formative experience that I had gone through to bring me to that view of what I should be doing. Then I'm going to just talk about the three triennials, as Alistair mentioned, to partly to give a context to this triennial, but also because I think, in retrospect, it's possible to think of them as a trilogy. They do work together as a unified enterprise. And then, lastly, I'm going to talk a little bit about my curatorial method, because that seems to be something which interests people a lot, and which I think is possibly very different to the way that many curators work. So first of all, what was it? Why a triennial in Folkestone? Andrea Schleicher was appointed to make an exhibition in, I think, 2006 by Roger de Haan. And the kind of exhibition that I had in mind at that moment. Forgive me, I know that some of you know all this, and some of you have heard me speak often, but I know also there are people in the audience for whom this is their first triennial and who have never heard me speak. So forgive me that I know some of you have heard this before, but it's new to others, and maybe I'm saying it in a different way from the way I've said it before. So Roger had in mind an exhibition that was going to be of, shall we say, sculpture placed along the Leas. And it would be there for a few months in the summer, and maybe some of them would get sold, and then they would arrive from the artist studio and they would return to the artist studio. And of course, that's how many exhibitions are made, how most exhibitions in public space probably are made. Andrea was born in the city of Munster in Germany, and there is something called Munster Sculpture Project, which takes place every 10 years. The first one was in 1977. And it established, this event, exhibition, established a reputation for Munster as the epitome of a city which was using art in public space in order to electrify the town. And so Andrea and Roger went off to see this the Munster sculpture project that took place in 2007. And Roger Town was convinced that this was a better model. And how it differed from the model that he had in mind is that the artists were invited to make art specifically, site-specific work, artworks that spoke to the very position that they were placed in the town. Munster has a long and fascinating history, as Folkestone does, and so artists were able to engage with this history along with the urban fabric of the town by making something new. So that's really completely different from the model of bringing something ready-made from a studio, putting it down, taking it away again at the end of the exhibition. Because people who are looking at the artwork in Munster or Folkestone know that it has been made for that place. They know that the artist has thought about, cares about, wants to engage with the specifics of that particular place. So immediately there's a bond between the artist and the public because they're both standing on the same ground. An artwork that comes from an artist's studio and is put in a field, if you like, you're being asked to imagine somehow that the field is the studio. And that's not the same kind of bond between artist and audience. Why did Roger Town want to make an exhibition called, or why was he persuaded to make a triennial? I mean, Munster Sculpture Project only takes place once every 10 years. Andrea persuaded him to fund an exhibition that was going to happen every 3 years. And why call it a triennial? I mean, it was called a triennial because it was going to happen every 3 years, but that immediately puts it in the family of triennials around the world, and triennials and biennials. And all of those exhibitions have very little in common other than the fact that they say, come and see me now. They are recurrent exhibitions, and the idea of a recurrent exhibition is that you see the change in art since the last one you saw. I mean, I could talk for a long time about biennials and triennials, but in the end, that's the essence of the idea. It's like a religious festival that happens every year. It's an opportunity to think back what has happened during the previous year. So that's and Roger wanted, or the idea at that time, with Nick Eubanks, who was director of the Creative Foundation, as it then was, the idea was to draw international attention to Folkestone. Why? Folkestone is an international town. I mean, I think it's easy to forget. We think of it as a seaside, an English seaside town. It's not. It's an international town. It's been international since the railway arrived in 1842, and the first scheduled interchange between trains and boats was established. The first in the world was established in Folkestone. If that isn't a claim to internationality, I don't know what is. And throughout the succeeding 150 years, Folkestone was known to everybody travelling to the UK or leaving the UK. So it really is an international town, deserves to be thought of as an international town, which adds a dimension to the history of Folkestone, which is much older and much more local. But I think it's really important to think of Folkestone in both of those dimensions. It's an international town as well as being simply a beautiful place, a beautiful locality. So, Creative Foundation, as I mentioned just now, has changed its name to Creative Folkestone. And so when Alistair and I started, it was just emerging from the state of having been a property letting organisation with a bit of arts on the side to becoming I mean, that's a very cruel way of putting it, but most of the staff employed at that time had previously worked in property in Saga or whatever, and the way in which the organisation was run was quite a distance from an arts organisation, pure and simple, despite the fact that Nick Eubank was obviously an arts director through and through. But the emphasis, the context in which Creative Foundation operated was the context of regeneration. And regeneration was thought of primarily in economic terms. So the parameters were about how much was it going to cost to refurbish buildings, how much could artists afford to pay if they rented them, what difference that would make to footfall on the high street and the commercial ability of other shops, and so on and so on. And my goodness, that was needed at the time. But already, shall we say, by 2015, things had changed quite a lot. There weren't so many empty shops. The economy had begun to revive, and the change of name from Creative Folkestone to from Creative Foundation to Creative Folkestone coincided with Alistair's rewriting of the mission, as it were, towards the idea of placemaking. So regeneration is a word that is used primarily in an economic context. People who want to talk about the revival of a town or the renaissance of a town know that there is more to that than economics. It's about culture as well as about economics. What an arts charity should be doing is focusing on the culture, not the economics. I mean, of course, the economics and the culture can't be separated in the end, but why be an arts charity without focusing on the cultural side? So the phrase placemaking was hardly used in this country. I mean, there was no reference to it in the media at all. I'll come back to this in a moment. But so the adoption of the phrase placemaking is a significant development for Creative Folkestone as it now is. I mean, so when we think of the Triennials being one of the 5 projects of Creative Folkestone, that's the context in which I hope it can be seen and judged. The fact that it is not about how many visitors come here to spend money. I mean, it's fantastic that for a budget of £2.5 million, the Triennial can generate £50 million for the local economy. But that's not the point of doing it. The point of doing it is to make people proud of where they live. It's to make people feel that they belong where they live because they've talked about what it is and how other people think about it. I was brought up in the countryside, and nature is an enormously rich context, it's an enormously rich environment. I mean, it's changing all the time. It's live and moving all the time. It speaks back to you if you speak to it. And that is the base condition in which we are all meant to live in our environment. I mean, that's where evolution has. That's where we have been throughout evolution. That's what our physical and mental well-being depends on. An environment that is changing and speaks back to us all the time, and which we know intimately, and which knows us. And many people living in towns don't get that. The idea of placemaking is that they could have that we could all have the well-being in the town that people who live in the country have naturally. If a place is well made, it can be as responsive and as rich as the countryside is for people who live there. Okay, enough about context. So then, how I came to placemaking, if you like, and how that became my personal interpretation of what I ought to be doing for Creative Foundation, as it then was. In 1998, while I was still director at Tate Liverpool, I had made an exhibition called Art Transpennine with a valued colleague called Robert Hopper, who sadly died in the year 2000. But Art Transpennine was a massive project. It involved 40 newly commissioned artworks in 30 different locations on a 150-mile road from Liverpool to Hull, across the whole of England, coast to coast. And it took us 3 years to make it. This is before I'd made any triennials. And it taught me a great deal about art outdoors, because most of the sites were outdoors, not all of them. But it contributed to my feeling of unease working in a museum, directing a museum, an unease which had been with me throughout my career up until then. I mean, I'd been an art historian, and then I started organising exhibitions and working in art galleries and museums. And I was super aware of the fact that many people won't step through the doors of a museum or gallery. And however wide open that door is, and whatever engagement is waiting for people on the inside, it's a question of context. You know, a museum which is called an art museum is about art. And if art is not important to you, why do you go through that door? I mean, art is important to me, so I love going into museums. But I completely understand why in Liverpool, 80% of the population, that was not the case. And so experiences such as Art Transpennine, organising this exhibition of art outdoors, really brought home to me how it was possible for art to have a life outside the museum or gallery, and to gain a meaning and a rationale that it could never have inside the museum or gallery. I mean, just to be very clear about that, it's about context. That if you call a museum an art museum, it is about art, and that everything you see in that museum, you will think is art, because that's the preparation that's gone into your head. And you will be judging it against other artworks and thinking of it in terms of the history of art or whatever. If you put an artwork in the street, you don't know what it is to begin with. You don't know whether it's an artwork or a piece of rubbish or a piece of craft or a piece of... You don't know what it is. Why should you know what it is? There's lots of stuff that happens in the street. It means you have to approach it with an open mind I mean, none of our minds are open ever. We approach things with the huge bulk of our experience, which has taught us to think about the world in particular ways. But for me, that's a more interesting context than saying, this is an artwork, you have to think about it, or you're going to think about it in the context of other artworks. And all of that is the reason why artists find it difficult to work outdoors. It's because their livelihood depends on what they make being thought of as art, and so why show it anywhere other than in an art gallery? And their training is also about how to add or contribute to the history of art, or develop the history of art. And again, why would they abandon that context for something as uncertain and difficult as real life? So it's, yeah, anyway, that's not what I meant to say at this point. I can get tripped up by my own enthusiasm so often. So art transpennine, yeah, was one of the things which really began to move me personally out of the museum. So then I helped James Moores start the Liverpool Biennial while I was still director of Tate, and the first one happened and it was great, but another one wasn't going to happen unless somebody took a firm line with it, and that turned out to be me. So I resigned from Tate in order to focus on making Liverpool Biennial happen, and I've never done a better thing in my life. It was a great decision because I was allowed to play with the town, with the city as my gallery, instead of having to put the art inside the museum. I was allowed to make all this art in the street. And then I was really, really taken aback because I went to a conference somewhere and I was introduced as a festival organizer, which had never occurred to me I was doing anything like that. But because exhibitions and festivals in the career that I'd had up until that day were seen as completely different ideas. But actually, once I realized I was making festivals, I quite enjoyed the idea. So then I did, as Alistair mentioned, I was chief executive artistic director of Liverpool Biennial for 10 years, and then I decided to go freelance, and one of the things which I began to do was an art, a research institute at Shanghai University called Institute for Public Art. And we started that in 2011, and this is really where my interest in placemaking began to take deep hold. And Institute for Public Art runs an international, global competition for art-led urbanism, what we call art-led urbanism. So that is artists making interventions in the urban environment, or actually the rural environment, but just in the built environment of some kind or another, that has an impact that changes the way the town or city, whatever it is, feels or operates or behaves. And so that's a competition, and I organise a network of researchers around the world to bring up case studies of how that works. But that's really where the notion of my sense as a placemaker myself and interest in artists who were leading that process took root. And so that's the background that I brought to Folkestone in January 2012 when I was invited to make a triennial. So to that extent, this is a kind of explanation of why the three triennials that we've had have been different from Andrea's 2 triennials. Andrea Schleicher, she made 2 fantastic exhibitions, but they were much more they were much more exhibitions, I think, than festivals, because she is and has always been an exhibition maker, and she went back to the Tate. And although she's completely into the idea of commissioned site-specific work, it was still in her mind the opportunity for an artist to make something wonderful, but it was not with the idea necessarily of placemaking. It wasn't. I mean, she allowed the artists to choose their own spaces wherever they wanted to make the art, rather than doing the research for them as to where they might put it, which is more the way that I do it. Okay, so these 3 exhibitions, festivals that I've made, the thing that the word that I discovered only recently that I hope describes them is proprioception. Proprioception is a word I hadn't come across until a couple of years ago, means awareness of your own body in space. So I guess it's something that dancers must have a lot of, but it's something which allows us to navigate our way through the built environment. I'm talking about dance, I see the town, the built environment, as a dance between live material and less live material. I mean, I say less live because all material changes over time. Nothing is static. But there's this dance between the behavior and thought of the people who are using the infrastructure and the infrastructure which is pushing back all the time and pushing us and guiding us and has been put there for a reason, very often a rather authoritarian reason, like the railings on roads, which are often so completely unnecessary, but they're put there by traffic engineers because traffic engineers like to keep people in controlled different areas. We know from places in London, for instance, where all fences have been taken away from the roads, there's no more accidents because the traffic goes slower. But anyway, these are interesting sidelines in urbanism. But awareness, yes. So I see the town in terms of this dance between people and materials. So look out. The first one, the first of the triennials I did was the idea of. Originally, I wanted every artwork to be visible from every other artwork, not from every other, from the last artwork. So you'd go to an artwork and you'd enjoy it, and then you would look around and you'd see the next artwork, and you'd walk to that, and you'd see that, and you'd enjoy that one, and then you'd see the next one. So you'd map your way across the town from one artwork to the other, looking out for the next one as it came along. I mean, of course, there's lots of other meanings to the word "look out," and that's important to me to have that kind of ambiguity of theme. But in terms of the 3 exhibitions, as it were, that one was about standing and looking, and thinking and talking, but standing. So quite, in a sense, quite static, quite one-dimensional in a way, because it's about stillness. Although stillness from which to look out towards the future. I mean, I did want it to be an exhibition about the future, drawing on the past, but but getting people to think about the future, because of course a lookout in almost any context is a place from which you are looking for what is going to happen next. The second one, double edge, is more kind of two-dimensional. That's to say, I mean, it's about edges in the town, particularly the edge along the seafront, the littoral, and also the edge created by the Pent Valley. But there's lots of other edges, lots of other ways of thinking of those same edges, frontier and boundary and threshold and so on. And this is more two-dimensional because there's a sense of motion in it, motion from one side of a boundary to the other, a motion along an edge, and so on. So that's more like two-dimensional. And then this current exhibition, the plot, I think of as more three-dimensional because it's about circular motion. As Sam Beninfanti's songs have it, circular motion. But this, I can't leave this particular plot without thinking about, without mentioning to you the urgency for me in that exhibition is about the gap between what we think and say, the narrative, and reality. I mean, what I think of as reality. I was brought up in the 50s, so I have a scientific view of what reality is. Reality is the material world that can be engineered, if you like. And the reason I got into art at all was because I read a scientific paper about frogs who died because they couldn't recognize the food in front of them. I mean, it's a longer story than that, but I just realized that humanity is killing itself because it can't see what is in front of it. We are so bound up in our heads with the narrative that we've invented and the stories we like to tell ourselves and the congratulations we like to give ourselves, that we can't see we're killing the planet. I mean, we knew about all this 60 years ago, but still we can't actually see it because we refuse to believe what is there, the material reality of it. It's not just climate change. This gap between our wished for life and life as it really is a glory of mankind humankind, because it allows a terrific release of energy to do stuff, but it is also, it trips us up all the time. It's going to be the death of us. Anyway, I mean, it's happening now with COVID, but there we go. So the urgency in the plot was about that sense of tragedy, if you like, but that tragic gap between the imagination and what is there is exactly what artists use to construct their art, and so it allowed me to make an exhibition that's both about the current affairs, if you like, the topicality of our political state, but also an exhibition that is entirely about art. I mean, as far as artists are concerned, it is an exposition of the way in which art is made. So I think that's all I'm going to say about the trilogy of triennials. I hope you may have some questions. My curatorial method, the last bunch of stuff I want to say. So since being director of Tate Liverpool, where my children went to school in the local comprehensives, and I was able to meet my children's friends' parents at the school gate and talk to them about what I was doing at the Tate. that sense of rootedness in a community has stayed with me as being completely necessary for a curator. That curators, I mean, somehow we have the idea that curators know about art, and of course they do need to know about art, but they need to know about their audience, and they need to know about the place in which they're making an exhibition. And as far as I'm concerned, the audience and the place are possibly even more important than the art, because it's because it's those three things together that will go to make the exhibition work or not work, mean something or mean nothing. So when I made an exhibition in Mongolia, when I was invited to do so, I said only on condition that I'm working with a curator from Mongolia who knows Mongolia. I can't make an exhibition in Mongolia unless, because I don't know Mongolia. How could I do that? I can't make an exhibition in Nagoya. I have to work with a local curator who has that background. So, as soon as I sold my house in Liverpool, I bought a flat in Folkestone because I knew I was going to have to spend time here in order to get to know what Folkestone is. So, and I have to put that on the table because for me it's really important. It's a part of my curatorial method, and I don't hear anyone talking about it in curatorial circles. I don't know why not. I think many curators don't care about the audience. They're making exhibitions for other curators.
You've said it now.
Nearly at the end. So what I've tried to do here in Folkestone is get to know what Folkestone is, the history, what I call the energy in, and there are locations that have more energy than others, and they have more energy because of their history or because of the plans for the future or whatever, but you can feel the energy in different parts, and so I try to locate where that energy is, and then I try to think of an artist's practice that will address that energy, that issue, that topic, whatever it is. So I don't start with a list of artists and try and find them places to put their work. I start with a list of places and try to find artists' practices. And I say practices because I only want an artist to do what an artist already does. It's working outdoors is really, really hard for any artist. And to ask them to work outdoors and do something which they don't already do is just too challenging, it's too much. I have invited a number of artists to work here in Folkestone outdoors, and they have said no, they can't do it because working outdoors is really, really tough. You have to think about the materials, you have to think about a lot of things that you don't have to think about if you're in the gallery or museum or studio. I think I'm going to stop there. Thank you very much for listening. And I would really love, I've gone on much longer than I intended to, I would really love to hear what you've been thinking. And Oliver here is going to allow us to hear what you've been thinking.
Yeah, Thanks. That was a fantastic talk, Lewis. Thanks very much. I like your idea about placemaking. But right at the beginning, you said that Folkestone is an international town. So is there a tension there between being very local, being very aware of your own place and its history and your part in it, and yet attracting tremendous international attention? So that there's this. How does this international element in Folkestone kind of manifest itself in a place where people live ordinary lives?
Well, the ordinary lives used to involve being stewards on ships, on ferries going across to Boulogne every day, and welcoming people from all over the world travelling on the ferries. So the internationalism in an overt sense has only not been there in the very recent past. I mean, the last 20 years, shall we say. The internationalism bypasses Folkestone using the Channel Tunnel these days. I mean, of course, some people who live in Folkestone work for the Channel Tunnel, so they experience the internationalism. But but the high internationalism of the 19th century and the early years of the 20th century, when the royalty and the court were here a lot of the time, and where royalty and the court are, then of course a lot of other things follow. I mean, apart from money, a lot of culture follows also. So the theatres and the orchestras and so on that were made available because of the court and the presence of the court. That is totally different from most seaside towns in this country. I mean, Brighton is the only other town which has a royal background in the sense that Folkestone does. And Brighton is clearly a cultural seaside town in a way that most other English seaside towns are not. When I say culture, I mean international culture. I mean Blackpool is an amazingly cultural place, but it's not an internationally cultural place. Is that the question? Is that the answer to the question? Yeah. Oh, please.
Does this make Folkestone people more open to culture than, say, Liverpool people? You said 80% of them never go into an art museum.
No, this is about, that remark was about art. Now we're talking about international culture. So Liverpool is an amazingly international town also because of the port, so actually people in Liverpool are fantastically open to different forms of culture in an international way. They are much more suspicious of what they see as, Westminster high culture being foisted on them. And I suspect that something of the same happens here in Folkestone. That's to say, people know what is in their interest and what isn't in their interest, and stuff that gets shown in some museums and galleries and so on in London or New York or whatever isn't necessarily in the interest of anybody who lives in Folkestone. That doesn't mean that an artist who exhibits in a museum in New York cannot also make an artwork in Folkestone that does mean something for people in Folkestone. But that's about the practice. It's not about the context, the organizational context. So, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. That was really fascinating, and thank you for all the work you've done. It's been amazing. It's made a big difference, I think, to Folkestone, and I certainly appreciate it, so thank you. But I had a question about the energy that you were talking about and where that is. And I think I know what you mean, but I just wondered whether, perhaps where some areas or some bits of energy haven't been so successfully transformed, or what your sense is for the future about how to tap into some of that energy and make something more of it.
Yeah. Yes. Very good question. Thank you. And I should have tried to say more about it. So from this triennial, I devised these three subplots: St. Eanswyth, William Harvey, and the Milky Way. And each of those, for me, represents an energy. I mean, St. Eanswyth was suggested to me really because 2 years ago, whenever it was, we had the Finding St. Eanswyth project, which had been funded by National Lottery. and that project put together a group of volunteers, very enthusiastic volunteers. And so there was a bunch of people who were already focused on a particular historical event or archaeological remains, with whom an artist could have a conversation. And the artist, therefore, had a ready-made living context into which to plug their artwork. So I would describe St. Eanswyth's water as a point of energy because of that recent history. William Harvey unfortunately, there hasn't been a lottery-led project about recently, but he happens to be probably the only really famous Folkestonian, and the only person we've got a statue of in the town, and so equally he seemed to me to represent a point of energy or a narrative that I could attach, that has its own energy that I could attach artworks to. and I mean, in particular, I was interested in Harvey because of the idea of circulation and our terrible one-way system for traffic, and it seemed an opportunity to excavate all of that stuff. And anything to do with traffic and car parking is a huge source of energy in this town. It's more easy to get people to talk about that than anything else. and the Milky Way, the Milky Way, strictly speaking, is Ford Road South, as you know, and the fact that our mosque is on Ford Road South, and the fact that the mosque is in a building that, when it was built in 1815, was probably one of the 3 or 4 most important buildings in Folkestone, I think is really interesting history. And that street and the mosque deserve to be better regarded than they are at the moment. And the kind of context of industrial and post-industrial is the most topical thing happening in Folkestone. I mean, what's made the biggest difference to Folkestone in the last few years? Probably the harbour arm. The harbour arm is a post-industrial use of an industrial heritage, a piece of industrial heritage. It's turning a dead piece of industrial heritage into an animated, live public space. and people are coming from miles away to see it and use it. So that shift from industrial to post-industrial is probably the most important thing happening in Folkestone right now. So that's 3 examples. I mean, that's just, but does that kind of flesh out what I mean by energy?
Yes, that's great.
Thank you. There's one here.
Right, well, I'm very interested to hear you particularly refer to the harbour arm, which very nearly falls within one of the plots. I just wonder whether you'd care to comment on the built infrastructure and the development of the built infrastructure relative to the triennial and artworks, and whether there should be more thought given to artistic input into some of the new buildings. Certainly the harbour arm has been a fantastic example of what can be done, and Folkestone Creative, of course, or Creative Folkestoners, had a big input into that. I'm not quite sure whether it's had much input into the block of flats currently being built on the foreshore, but I wonder whether you'd care to comment on that relative to triennial and artistic input.
So, so yes, building opportunities in Folkestone and how whether Creative Folkestone can, through the triennial, influence the way they develop. We've been trying to get the council to do something about the gasworks site since 2012. I mean, that's I didn't know it existed until I was taken there by Joe Cowdery in 2012, and it's you know, there's no other word than shameful for the fact that the people in that part of town, 5 minutes walk from Central Station, have been living beside a huge blacked out, barbed wire defended, empty area of developable land. Of course, there's lots of problems with it, but why look at the problems? Why not look at the benefits? If the council had done something about it 20 years ago, as they might have done, that part of town would be completely different today. People complain about the various kinds of antisocial behaviour that happen in the Pent Valley, but all of that could have been changed if there had been some initiative by local government to make sure that that area was developed. Because it is prime land. It's as I've written and you've, I'm sure, read, in the earliest luxury villas in Folkestone were built on the land that the gasworks site subsequently came onto, and they had to be knocked down in order to build the gasworks site. So yes, the Triennial wants to get involved with the development of new buildings, new built environment, and the tram road is another example. Obviously, we're in constant conversation with the councils about what is going to happen to the tram road and how to use artists. Well, I think to some extent the Gabriel Lester bamboo piece that was on the harbour viaduct was helpful in allowing the refurbishment of the harbour viaduct to take place. Have I forgotten something?
I think that was a remarkably thoughtful response, actually, because you've mentioned areas in which the Creative Folkestone have been involved, which most people don't even begin to think about. And there are massive opportunities, if they can be developed, to actually make Folkestone a more pleasant and agreeable place, along with the artistic sculptures and so on.
Yes.
But there needs to be some artistry in the development as well. Thank you for your
I have to say, I don't know if there's anyone here with close ties to local government, but it is really, really difficult to get anybody to think about anything east of the Pent Valley, which is where, you know, a lot of the triennial artworks now are placed, because that's where change needs to take place.
Thank you for Triennials, and thank you for today's talk. I have a couple of very practical questions about the artwork. On the circulation of the blood, it has been placed in 2 locations, and I can understand why in 2 different locations, but I just was wondering what was the drive for moving artwork from near the school to amphitheatre. And the second question is whether have you anticipated that Janus is going to be demolished so quickly?
Yes. So Sam Beninfanti's on the circulation of blood was conceived really as a more movable installation than it has turned out to be. It was originally, well, until the last moment, and I think it's even still in the guide to some extent, we thought it was going to have 3 places. We thought it was going to be in St. Peter's School and in the marketplace and in the amphitheatre. And at the very last moment, we discovered that the town hall was going to put up scaffolding on the back of the town hall and mend the roof, and that would have completely ruled out the possibility of Sam Beninfanti's artwork being there. So it was intended to. I mean, if it had had the 3 venues, I think the notion of it moving across town would have been more obvious and more evident and more felt by people. It was also originally going to have a larger number of daily performances, as it were, just 1 or 2 people doing things during the day to animate the installation. And I'm afraid that that was a casualty of the budget, but specifically because we decided to keep the exhibition on for a much longer period. We kept it on for 14 weeks instead of 9 weeks. And so, of course, anything which involved equipment hire or people on a daily basis became much more expensive. And so COVID has played its part in, I'm afraid, in making Sam's work not turn out the way we originally intended it to. But it was meant to be, to give a sense of animating pathways through the town. I mean, yeah. Perhaps you'd like to say something else about that, but I'll just try and answer your other question too, which was Janus. Yes, we did plan with the artist in some detail the idea that the artwork would erode and disintegrate over the period of the exhibition. And of course it's in 2 exhibitions. It's also in the Waterfronts exhibition of England's Creative Coast. And so it opened to the public a month before, or more than a month before the Triennial did. So it was going to be over a kind of 20-week period that it was going to disintegrate. And her idea was very simple, that you can stand there and you see the chalk cliffs, and they're eroding, they're disintegrating, and the chalk cliffs stand for Fortress England, and she likes to point out that Fortress England is disintegrating. And so Janus, Fortress, she wanted to disintegrate over the period of in the same way that the chalk cliffs do. I mean, it's a fair enough proposition, but how to actually manufacture something that is going to disintegrate at exactly the right speed, 20-week period, was challenging. And she spent weeks with the fabricator. You know, she had very hands-on opportunity to know exactly what was going on, but I think she lost her nerve, that she thought that it wasn't going to disintegrate, and she really wanted it to disintegrate. And that's why she went on the radio just before the exhibition opened and invited people to start demolishing it, which I have to say, as the curator and as the person responsible for other artworks, I was not happy about. But we have what we have.
Thank you. On the circulation of blood performances, they were just absolutely amazing. I was fortunate to attend the last one.
It was beautiful,
it was so beautiful.
Yeah.
Just perfect.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. One down here, Oliver. Whoops.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure if this is a question, but it starts with an observation. You said you moved here and bought an apartment here. Were you kind of watching the gentrification also of your apartment, and will you be moving on? But then you kept saying our Folkestone, our town, as if it belongs to you, as if this is something, your place, and was that genuine? And I don't mean it wasn't genuine, but were you aware you were using this preposition of owning Folkestone in this sense? And linked to that is, will you be staying here, and how will it be when the next curator shows up? Will you be hovering around, fussing about, or turning a blind eye? What are you expecting if you stay here?
Okay, so I am staying here. I think the use of our is necessary if you're going to feel proud of something. I feel proud of Folkestone. I have to say, I feel proud of Folkestone. It's a great place to live. And if I call it your Folkestone, I don't think that helps. I want to live here. I think why shouldn't I call it my Folkestone? What was the other bit?
How are you going to manage the next?
No, I don't. I mean, actually, I have very little expectation about what the next person does. I mean, I am really committed to the notion of placemaking, and creative Folkestone is also. And so I think that whoever becomes the curator of the next triennial is going to have to argue that case. They're going to have to position themselves in relation to placemaking, either by continuing to do it in the same way, or by continuing to do it in a different way, or by saying, no, we're not going to do that anymore, we're going to do something else because. But those three options are all there. And I don't want to prejudge any of them.
Can I just add one thing? Are you expecting some of these artworks to live on afterwards in the sense that policies have changed, actual change happens in the town, provoked by the pieces which have now disappeared?
I mean, it might be easy to talk about individual pieces, but in general, I do see that as the way things go. I mean, that's to say, artworks have a lifespan. If they're extremely lucky and good artworks, their lifespan might be long, but most artworks in the public realm are not going to last very long because the public realm is going to change. And if it changes, then the meaning of the artworks change. And if the meaning of the artworks change, why keep it? And unless it says something else which is very interesting, but that's not particularly likely. So I don't see the artworks as being any more permanent than anything else in town. Everything changes. The highways, the buildings, the parks, everything changes all the time. And it's absolutely right that the artwork should do that too. This is not a museum. Museums are there in order to stop things changing. Towns have to change in order to stay alive. And so the art in them should change also.
Thank you so much for your talk, and I want to also thank you for the podcasts that you did, because they provide 3 excellent days doing those. But this is coming from a comment you made on one of the podcasts about the gasworks being a crime scene, and I've just been sitting here thinking about the different narratives within the plot, and I actually think there is something around crime and neglect. So you can look at the gasworks as a site, but also on the circulation of blood, given the infected blood inquiry, and of course the Gilbert and George. So I was wondering if there is something about that dynamism of being in the outside space that really impacts upon this ability to see those different narratives in play, as opposed to a very kind of cloistered museum. I also used to work in a museum, so there was lots of recognition from what you just said.
I really enjoyed what you said, but I've forgotten what is there a question in there, or yes, one?
It's about that idea of the outside space providing. Do you agree that the outside allows that multiplicity of narratives in a different way than a kind of more cloistered environment?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, it is also true of visitors to museums that what people see in the museum is mostly already in their heads. I mean, all of us only take in, well, I'm told 90% of what we actually see is what's already in our head, and what comes in, the light that comes in through the eye only provides 10% of what it is that we see. Our brains are so powerful, they just project what we want to know onto the world. And so, because everybody is different, the object in the museum appears different to everybody, and that multiplicity but of course in the museum, because of the context, it does tend to close down the number of different readings you can make, or that people want to make. Whereas the element of surprise in the urban environment, the element of surprise, not knowing whether it's an artwork or not, for a start, and then not knowing why it's there and trying to work out why it's there, all of that is a great stimulus to diversity. Actually, it's a great stimulus to what your word is, multiplicity. Yes.
I just wondered if I'm sure there isn't a common theme, but if there are bullet points or one massive point that gets your attention of how someone can become an artist when you curate.
Of how someone could become an artist.
Sorry, of who you might choose, like when you're curating, is there a key element that always sparks you that is the reason for why someone is chosen?
Yes, I mean, the way that I work is I'm just the kind of person who operates on a very material level, but also on a very conceptual level at the same time. So I am hugely attracted by artwork that is material poetry, if you like. That is something that is hugely lyrical, but also really solid. So artists that have a practice of that kind are more likely to get my attention than artists who don't. But I don't know if your question was meant to be more general about what are curators looking for, or whether it was personal to me.
No, it was personal to you. I just wondered, with the fact you've done multiple triennials here at Folkestone, I just wondered if there's obviously never going to just be one thing, but I was just intrigued if there was anything.
I think that's how I would describe it, yes. I mean, I remember the director of the Whitechapel Art Gallery came down here with her patrons of the art gallery, and she asked me a similar question. She said, Lewis, I don't see where the common sensibility is in all of these artworks. And that was pretty much the answer that I gave her. But because it's not an aesthetic. I mean, it's not a style. You know? It's not a style. It's not a movement. It's not something you can categorize in that way. But it's about my temperament and my preferences as a person. I like things with me move from the senses to the head. I mean, and I've watched people in museums walk into a room and they do one of two things. Some kinds of people gravitate immediately to the labels, and they read all the labels, and then they might or might not look at the artworks, because it's actually the labels is how they approach the world. That's their temperamental preference. Other people walk into the middle of the room, scan around, if something attracts them, they walk and engage with it. And if it doesn't, they walk out of the room. And they might or might not read the label on the way out. But, but you know, all of those different ways of working are, I mean, humans work in many different ways. But I suspect that there are probably more people who do the latter than the former, actually, fortunately. Maybe that is changing with our increasingly conceptually led culture.
I definitely like to see pieces and not know anything about them. So, thank you.
But when you say you do not know anything about them, 90% of what that thing is already in your head. Mm. You know it already. You know it.
But I guess what I mean is to see it and not have read up on it or read it through someone else.
Who is the authority other than you?
No, but that's what I mean, to not have any interference.
Yeah.
So you like if you read about a film before you see it, yeah. Even if you disagree before you've seen it, you've already got a concept. But I think the joy of seeing something...
I hate that. I mean, I have to say, you know, I make a point of not meeting an artist before I have seen their work, if I possibly can, because I want to make up my mind whether I like that art, whether that art says anything, before I meet the artist. Once you've met the artist, you get confused about what's the artist and what's the artwork. I mean, and if the artist is nice, then you're tempted to like the art. And if the art is nasty, you're tempted to not like the art. But it's, all of that has nothing to do with the art.
Exactly.
Hello, Lewis. It's a very light-hearted question. This is your last triennial. I was just wondering at what stage you feel you are in the grieving process.
Well, I did tell Alistair 2 years ago that I wasn't going to do another one. So I think I'm quite far on. Probably acceptance, yeah. Thank you.